Syphilis, a disease that starts as an embarrassing sore, then explodes into a full-body nightmare. Your skin festers with foul-smelling boils. Your bones rot from the inside, causing excruciating pain. Your skull is eaten away, pitted like a honeycomb. The roof of your mouth may die on an unsuspecting Europe. This story seems to be perfectly borne out by historical events. Syphilis seemed to have appeared out of nowhere at the Siege of Naples in 1495. This was a multinational mercenary army, and when they dispersed, they carried the disease with them to every corner of the continent. Its horrors were well documented. An eyewitness, Joseph Grunpeck, wrote of it as a medical apocalypse. A cruel, miserable, horrible disease. Nothing more horrible or more disgusting has ever been known on Earth. He described soldiers turned into loathing, groaning with genital ulcers, left on the battlefield to die. It was so new, so terrible, that no nation wanted to take it in. The French called it Neapolitan disease. The Germans called it Spanish disease. The story of its origin in the New World was a perfect scapegoat. That story has been accepted as fact for 500 years. Scientists like George Armalagos are absolutely convinced. He has skeletons and argues that the evidence is clear. Countless cases of bones showing signs of disease in the Americas before 1492, but there is almost no evidence at all in the Old World. It was a case closed, until an archaeologist's shovel hit wet mud beneath a multi-story car park in Hull, England. City planners wanted to build a new courthouse. They gave a local archaeological team permission to survey the site first. Working day and night, the team found what they suspected, the ruins of a medieval monastery. But the scale of it was astonishing. They unearthed the entire floor plan of a long-forgotten Augustinian monastery, and inside that monastery, they found a cemetery. More than 240 skeletons were carefully removed from the ground. The preservation conditions were extraordinary. Project leader John Buglass described, "We have coffin remains, pieces of cloth, leather, we have bodies with shoes still on. It was a complete view of a lost world." But something was wrong. Soon as we got the skeletons, Buglass says, we started seeing things that were quite unusual, particularly a lot of infectious diseases. The skeletons were sent to Bradford University for in-depth analysis. This is where Charlotte Roberts, a leading expert in paleopathology, the archaeology of disease, came in. Diagnosing disease from ancient bones is extremely difficult. Most diseases leave no trace. But syphilis does. And then she saw it. Skeleton 1216, a man who died between 25 and 35 years old. He was the most extreme example. What Roberts saw wasn't speculation, it was a medical indictment carved in bone. She pointed to the skull. A healthy skull should be smooth. 1216's skull was pitted, full of pitting lesions. This was, Cry says, a classic sign of syphilis, where the disease eats away at the skull and the body desperately tries to heal. She pointed to the roof of his mouth. In life, the man would not be able to speak or eat properly, and his breath would have the stench of rotting tissue. Finally, she pointed to her leg bones. They were swollen and deformed. The tibia was covered by a thick layer of new bone on the front, causing it to curve outward, a condition known as saber shin. It was the result of years of excruciating inflammation. Roberts concluded unequivocally, "These are features of venereal syphilis. You don't see it in any other syndrome." The discovery presented an irreconcilable contradiction. Scientists were holding incontrovertible evidence of syphilis, but history said the disease could not have been here. They were in a medieval English monastery. The only question that remains, the question that could rewrite 500 years of history, is, who died in 1216? When? If he died after 1492, he was just another tragic victim of the Columbus plague. But if he died before, well, that's shocking information. It means the whole story about the origin of syphilis is a lie. A stroke of luck came from the excavation site itself. The waterlogged conditions had preserved countless wooden coffins. This was a gift to scientists. Ian Tyers, an expert in dendrochronology, stepped in. His methods were precise. By analyzing the tree rings, the unique fingerprints left by good and bad weather, he could pinpoint the exact year the trees were felled. He took more than 300 samples. The results were clear. The trees with intact bark, he declared, were all felled between 1340 and 1360. 1340s and 1360s. This was consistent with pottery and other historical records, but it sent shockwaves through academia, because it meant that the 1216 skeleton, a man with syphilis, had been buried and therefore dead 150 years before Columbus. Coffin? Armelagos clarifies. If they find, for example, a radiocarbon date that puts it before 1492, then I will have to explain. Charlotte Roberts knew this was the ultimate test. She needed irrefutable proof. She needed to date the skeleton itself. She took samples from 1216's own bones and sent them to a radiocarbon dating lab in Oxford, the gold standard for measuring the decay of carbon-14 to determine when an organism died. And then, the result is returned. The lab converted the carbon date into calendar time. The results were definitive. Even allowing for a conservative margin of error, the young man with syphilis certainly died between 1300 and 1420 AD. At least 70 years. 70 years before Christopher Columbus set sail in search of the New World. 500-year-old theory has been shattered into pieces. The lie collapsed. Syphilis was not a vengeful gift from the Americas. Anyone knew of America's existence. Christopher Columbus, the man history has blamed for bringing a sexual plague to the Old World, has been exonerated. But Skeleton 1216, in his silence, raises a far more terrifying question. If this monster was always here, why did it suddenly explode with such ferocity in 1495? And where did it really come from? The real mystery of syphilis has only just begun. The 1216 skeleton offered a shocking timeline. The radiocarbon date of 1300 to 1420 AD was more than just a number. It was a direct challenge to 500 years of medical history. It said syphilis was present in England long before Columbus. But such a grand challenge requires an unbreakable foundation of evidence. Defenders of the Columbus theory, like George Armelagos, have built their careers on thousands of skeletons in the Americas. They won't abandon history just because one skeleton. They will attack the most obvious weak point, diagnosis. How can we be sure that it is really syphilis? This is the realm of paleopathology, the forensic science of the past, and it is incredibly difficult. Most of history's greatest killers, the Black Death, smallpox, influenza, cholera, are ghosts. They kill their victims quickly and brutally, but leave no trace on the skeletons. An archaeologist excavating a plague cemetery would be unable to distinguish them from those who died of starvation. But syphilis is different. Syphilis is not a ghost. It is a brutal sculptor. It not only kills, it rewrites a body. It is a slow-moving disease, a decades-long war of attrition between bacteria and the immune system. And that war leaves unmistakable scars, etched into the very bones. At the University of Bradford, Charlotte Roberts, one of the world's leading experts on the archaeology of disease, performed a dissection on the 1216 skeleton. What she found was not a single sign, but a classic constellation of symptoms, an irrefutable medical. With the skull, Roberts placed 1216's skull next to a healthy one. A healthy skull has a smooth, even surface. 1216's skull looked like a battlefield. It was covered in what scientists call caries sicca, pitted lesions, which appear corroded, as if someone had sprinkled acid on the surface. This is not post-mortem decomposition. This is evidence of biological warfare. Roberts explains that this is a pathological cycle of frantic destruction and regeneration. The syphilis bacteria attack the bone, destructive lesions, and the body's immune system desperately tries to heal, creating new, rough layers of bone, osteoblast lesions. What did this mean in life? It meant open, oozing sores on the man's scalp. Sores that wouldn't heal, eating through the skin, through the muscle, until they reached an cavity and mouth had completely eroded away, leaving a gaping hole. In life, the consequences would have been horrific. The man's soft palate would have collapsed. His voice would have been distorted, making sounds through his nose. Every time he tried to eat or drink, food and liquid would have regurgitated into his nasal cavity. Furthermore, with an active infection, pus seeping from his mouth and nose, his breath would have had the horrible stench of necrotic tissue. But the most striking evidence, a sign any medical student would recognize, lies in the legs. The femur, the longest bone in the body, was covered in layers of new, rough, lumpy bone. But it was the tibia, shin bone, that caused the shock. It was completely deformed. The front of the bone, which is usually relatively flat, was covered with a large amount of newly formed bone, causing it to thicken and curve out. Roberts, speaking from experience, described the agony the man endured. "Imagine the inflammation," she said, "the swelling of these limbs, the redness, the heat, the pain. This was not a fracture that would heal. This was chronic, painful inflammation that lasted for years, if not decades." When you put it all together, the pitted skull, the perforated palate, and the sword-shaped tibia, the conclusion is inevitable. These are the features, Roberts declared emphatically, of venereal syphilis. You don't see it in any other syndrome. The diagnosis was clear, but the academic battle had only just begun. When Charlotte Roberts presented her findings, she was met with skepticism. George Armelogos, a leading proponent of the Columbus theory, remained unconvinced. He confronted her at an international conference in Texas. He admitted that the 1216 skeleton looked classic, but he had a simple question. How many skeletons have been unearthed in England? 50,000? If syphilis was really widespread in medieval Europe, why is this the only clear-cut case? Why don't we find thousands of skeletons like this, like he found in America? The absence of evidence, to him, was evidence of absence. This is where Charlotte Roberts offers her most profound explanation, one that not only defends her diagnosis, but also paints a tragic picture of medieval life. She explains that the reason we don't find many syphilitic skeletons is not because the disease is rare, but because life is too short. Syphilis is a slow killer. The horrific bone lesions we see in 1216 are from stage tertiary. This stage, as modern doctors know, can take 10, 20, or even 50 years to develop after the initial infection. Now consider life in 14th century Europe. It was a world without antibiotics, without sanitation, and it was haunted by the Black Death. It was during the time the 1216 skeleton lived, 1300 to 14 population. In that brutal environment, Roberts argues, most people who contracted syphilis died of some cause before the disease had time to eat into their bones. They died of the plague, they died of cholera, smallpox, war, or a simple infected wound. They died with syphilis in their bodies, but their skeletons remained clean. This turned skeleton 1216 from an anomaly into an invaluable witness. He is not the only one with the disease. He is the only one survive long enough. He was a man who, by some ironic stroke of luck, avoided the plague, avoided smallpox, and survived the harsh winters long enough for syphilis to reach its final stages and leave its pathological autobiography for us to find. He died young, before 40, but he lived long enough. At the conference in Texas, the confrontation came to a head. Roberts presented his photos to Armelogos and an independent witness, Don Ortner, a forensic expert at the Smithsonian Institution. Ortner's reaction was immediate. "I must say, this is clearly a classic case of syphilis," he declared. "Any experienced anatomist would recognize these lesions immediately." The diagnosis was confirmed by an independent expert. The radiocarbon dating was irrefutable. The scientific debate was over. The 1216 skeleton did indeed have syphilis, and he had died long before Columbus. But solving this scientific mystery opens up an even more troubling social mystery. Robert's diagnosis was specific: venereal syphilis. This is not a common infectious disease. This is a sexually transmitted disease. And the skeleton of 1216, his body ravaged by venereal disease, was not dumped in an anonymous grave reserved for sinners. He was buried in one of the most prestigious locations in the entire complex, right next to the main altar of the Abbey Church. In the medieval hierarchy, this was the most expensive spiritual real estate, reserved for the highest-ranking monks or the wealthiest noble. It is no longer, was there syphilis in Europe? But what the hell was going on inside a monastery in Hull in the 14th century? The 1216 skeleton has been proven to be a man who died of venereal syphilis at least 70 years before Columbus set sail. But this scientific fact raises an even more troubling historical mystery. That's where he was found. He was not dumped in an anonymous pit, nor buried in a cemetery for outcast sinners. The skeleton of 1216 was buried in one of the most prestigious, sacred, and expensive locations in the entire complex, right next to the main altar of the monastery church. It is a contradiction that shakes our understanding of the medieval world. This place was an Augustinian monastery. The people who lived here were monks. They were people who had sworn to live 3 vows: poverty, obedience, and most importantly, chastity. They were the social purity. Do we find undeniable evidence of a sexually transmitted disease? And 1216 was not an isolated case. When paleopathologists examined more than 240 skeletons, they found that more than 60% of the adult bodies showed signs of infection, with many showing features consistent with syphilis. This was no private secret. It was a public health crisis unfolding within the monastery walls. This mystery forced archaeologists to look beyond the skeletons and investigate the monastery itself. What did they find? First, they discovered that this was not a quiet, isolated monastery cut off from the world. The Augustinian monks were not hermits. Their monastery was intentionally located in the commercial heart of the town, sandwiched between the houses of wealthy merchants and the docks of one of Europe's busiest seaports. Hull was no remote village. It was an international trading hub. Coffin wood came from the Baltic, porcelain came from France, and wine came from Spain. Historical records show a staggering 1.5 million liters of wine were imported into Hull each year. Archaeologist John Buglas doesn't hesitate to call this a sign of a high level of debauchery. And evidence of that debauchery was found within the monastery walls. Excavations uncovered a large collection of imported wine vessels. The monks clearly drank more than just water. The vow of chastity was questioned by the skeletons themselves. Now, evidence from the wine suggests the vow of poverty is also under threat. And then the archaeologists found evidence of corruption. The priests had turned death into a lucrative business. They were experts in the afterlife, and they capitalized on it. They sold candles, sold shrouds, presided over funerals, and most importantly, they sold prayers for the souls of the dead, all paid for by wealthy merchants and aristocrats to buy their way into heaven. A surviving medieval will from Hull exposed this system. The will stipulated that a sum of money be set aside for each monk to attend the person's funeral mass. The head of the excavation called this a system extremely open to abuse. You could call in monks from every church in the area to increase the numbers and make more money. The image of a poor, chaste monastery had completely collapsed. Here was a center of power, wealth, and international influence. It was a melting pot of trade, religion, money, and, as the skeletons demonstrate, sex and disease. It was a melting pot of population movements. You had people from the Baltic, from Spain, from the Netherlands, France, Poland, and because you had such a high population turnover, disease would come in, the archaeologists note. This brings us back to the final question. So, who is Skeleton 1216? He was buried in the most expensive spot. Historians know that these spots were holy, but inwardly ravaged by a shameful disease? Or was he a wealthy merchant who had lived a life of debauchery and then, facing death, paid a fortune to the monks to be buried on holy ground, hoping his wealth would wash away the sins his body carried? The honest answer is, we will never know. But in the end, it doesn't matter. Whether 1216 was a monk or a merchant doesn't change the historical facts. What matters is that he existed. What matters is that this monastery, the center of the urban elite, was filled with people like him. The Hull discovery was more than just a single skeleton. It exposed an entire ecosystem. It proved that venereal syphilis not only existed, but was widespread among the elite of this prosperous community 150 years before Columbus set sail. The mystery of the monastery was solved. It was not an oasis. Urbanization, international trade, wealth, and close human contact in teeming port cities. The question is no longer who brought syphilis to Europe, The new, deeper question is, why? How did this disease thrive here? What is it about civilized society that turned an ancient bacteria into a sexually transmitted killer? The 1216 skeleton and the Hull Abbey rewrote medieval European history. They proved that venereal syphilis existed in the Old World 150 years before Columbus set sail. A 500-year-old lie had collapsed. But if history is so wrong, where does the story really begin? Was Hull an anomaly, an isolated outbreak that burned itself out and then disappeared? Or is it just one chapter in a much longer, deeper story that we have completely missed? The investigation now had to go back further, past the Middle Ages, past the Dark Ages. If Hull, an urban seaport, scarred by the same scars? The quest leaves foggy England and heads to the Mediterranean sunshine of southern Italy, to a place called Metaponto, an ancient Greek settlement that flourished 600 years ago before AD. Two anthropologists, Maddie and Renata Henneberg, excavated nearly 300 skeletons from the city's ancient cemetery. Maddie Henneberg began analyzing the bones, looking for signs of disease, but he was stumped. What I could see on the bones, he described, in terms of physical signs of disease, made no sense. The patterns of damage did not match tuberculosis, scurvy, or any of the common ancient diseases he expected. The bones told a strange story he could not decipher. It took me 2 weeks, he says, to accept the idea that signs only fit syphilis. It was a seemingly impossible conclusion. The 2,600-year-old skeletons were showing him exactly what Charlotte Roberts had seen in Hull. Classic lesions, bone destruction, and bone remodeling, the unmistakable signs of syphilis. This was 2,000 years earlier than the 1216 skeleton. But even then, a skeptic might still argue. Perhaps it was some other form of bacteria, a non-sexually transmitted skin disease like Yaz or Begel that could leave similar marks on bones. How could they prove that this was indeed syphilis, venereal syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease? The answer, the ironclad proof, didn't come from Maddie. It came from his wife, Renata, a dental expert. She had found something that, until then, Columbus supporters had claimed existed only in the Americas, evidence of syphilis natural. Syphilis is one of the few diseases that can be passed directly from mother to fetus. When this happens, it interferes with the child's tooth formation, leaving behind unique, unmistakable marks, grooved, arched incisors known as Hutchinson teeth, and malformed molars. Renata found these exact teeth on the skeleton of a child in Metaponto, ancient Greece, but that it was a form willow, because only that form can be transmitted congenitally from mother to child. Maddie was very happy, Renata recalls, because we finally had the full picture of syphilis. This discovery opened the door. If it existed in Greece, what about Rome? The Roman Empire, with its highly urbanized cities, bustling seaports, and global trade networks, was the perfect environment for the mutation theory. The Henneberg team turned their attention to Pompeii, the Roman city buried in 79 AD. They didn't just look at bones. They expanded their search to include Latin texts, Roman medical documents, and the city's cultural context. They found evidence everywhere. Pompeii was a thriving commercial port. It was known for its brothels, public houses, and a culture that tolerated debauchery. Medical texts described symptoms, genital ulcers, rashes, and late-stage neurological. Cultural and skeletal was combined, a clear picture emerged. Syphilis was rampant in the classical world. A clear pattern was established, lasting for thousands of years. Metaponto, 600 TCN, Pompeii, 79 SCN, Hull, 1300 to 1420 SCN, Naples, 1495 SCN. What do they all have in common? They are not isolated farming villages. They are bustling, cosmopolitan, urban centers. They are seaports. They are the intersection of commerce, wealth, population movement, and commercial sex. The mystery of syphilis has finally been solved. The disease never arrived from the Americas. It was an ancient companion, always lurking in the human genome. Like a dormant virus, it existed in a mild cutaneous form in rural societies. But whenever and wherever humans built complex, civilized cities, wherever clothing and sanitation cut off the childhood transmission routes, sail at the right moment in history when a particularly virulent, mutated version of an ancient disease was on the rise, and he became the perfect scapegoat. The investigation turned history on its head. The evidence was incontrovertible. Venereal syphilis, the sexually transmitted killer, had existed in the Old World since ancient Greece, through the Roman Empire, and into medieval England. Columbus was vindicated. But this creates an even bigger paradox. If the disease has always been present in Europe, why is it so rare? Why do paleopathologists like Charlotte Roberts struggle to find a few classic cases, like the 1216 skeleton? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Columbus proponents like George Armelagos were right about one thing. There was evidence of syphilis in the Americas. It wasn't just a few skeletons, he found countless cases. The evidence stretched from Florida up to Ohio, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. He found evidence not just in individuals, but in the entire population. How could this happen? How could it be that in the Old World, the disease was rare, confined to urban seaports, while in the New World, it was common and widespread? The answer, the final key to unlocking the mystery of syphilis, lies not in history or archaeology. It lies in evolutionary biology. It lies in the bacteria's own terrifying adaptability, Treponema pallidum. It turns out we were wrong to assume that there was only one syphilis. Syphilis is a survivor, the documentary explains, and to survive, it has mutated to adapt to different climates and different societies. It hasn't always been a killer. To understand this, scientists looked to warm, rural communities around the world. Researcher Mary Lucas Powell studied bacteria Treponema pallidum in its New World setting before Columbus arrives, and she found a completely different picture. In pre-Columbian America, especially in the warmer southeastern regions, the environment was quite different from that of European cities. People wore fewer clothes. They lived in close-knit communities. They had a pattern of sharing common eating utensils and bedding. In this environment, the bacteria doesn't need to be transmitted sexually. It has a much easier route, regular skin-to-skin contact. Under this condition, bacteria exist in a completely different form. Notifica is a sexually transmitted disease. It is an ugly skin disease, a disease that everyone gets when they are young. It is similar to Yaz or Bejel, cousins of syphilis that still exist today. It can cause skin and bone damage, which explains the thousands of skeletons of Armelagos, but it is rarely fatal. But here is the most important discovery, the key to the whole mystery. People, the documentary emphasizes, who had this disease as children, have been immunity against the dangerous venereal form of the disease. Entire populations of Native Americans, by living with this mild form of the disease, were inadvertently naturally immune. Immunized. Like chickenpox, they contracted it as children and acquired lifelong immunity. This is why syphilis, will it, did not exist in pre-Columbian America. It could not take root. The entire population was immune. The paradox was resolved. Armelagos was right to find thousands of skeletons, but it was a skin disease, not a sexually transmitted disease. Now back to the Old World, back to the crowded streets of Pompeii, Metaponto, and Hull. What happened here? The answer is civilization. Venereal syphilis, the researchers concluded, is primarily a disease of cities of advanced civilizations. What does civilization mean? It means colder climates. It means wearing clothes. It means better hygiene. It means less sharing of eating utensils. All these social advances, clothing, separate housing, personal hygiene, inadvertently did one thing. Bacteria Treponema pallida transmitted easily from skin to skin mutated. Unable to spread through casual contact, bacteria have found the only remaining route from one body to another. The most intimate, most trusted route of contact that civilization cannot eradicate. The syphilis bacteria have found their way to the warm sexual parts of the body and are waiting. It has transformed from a childhood skin disease into a sexually transmitted killer. This was the genius explanation for the whole mystery. It explained why the disease was concentrated among the urban, sophisticated elite like those at Hull Abbey. They were the most civilized. They were the cleanest. They were the ones who, thanks to hygiene and clothing, had avoided form of childhood skin disease. And that's why they are the ones completely immune when they encounter this new, deadly mutation. Bacteria had been everywhere, in both the Old World and the New World, for thousands of years. The real question is always why it turned into a venereal disease. And the answer is ironic. It was the advances of human society, hygiene, clothing, and the rise of cities that inadvertently created evolutionary pressures, forcing a mild skin disease to mutate into the monster we know today. We do not receive syphilis from the New World. Somehow we have created out it. But the story is not over yet. There is one final chapter left, one final twist of history, a tragic circle that will close the fate of the very people who have been wrongly blamed for 500 years. We have solved the mystery. The answer to the syphilis enigma is not a place or a people. It is a process. Bacteria, treponema, has been an ancient companion of mankind, existing in both the Old World and the New World for thousands of years. In the New World, America, it exists as a mild, contagious skin disease of children in warm climates. This form of the disease naturally immunizes entire populations, making them immunity with deadly venereal form. In the Old World, Europe, civilization, clothing, hygiene, cold climates blocked that skin-to-skin transmission route. Cornered, the bacteria mutated. It became a sexually transmitted killer to survive, attacking the clean, urban elite with no immunity, like Skeleton 1216. The investigation is complete. History has been rewritten. Christopher Columbus and the Native Americans have been vindicated. They did not start this disease. But the story is not over yet. There is one final chapter left. One final twist in the tale. A twist of history, so cruel and tragic it is almost unbelievable, for the very people who have been wrongly blamed for 500 years. Let's go back to 1492. Native American things. They brought the real killers of the Old World: smallpox, measles, influenza. These diseases swept through the Americas like an apocalyptic fire. The native people had absolutely no immunity to them. In some areas, 90% of the population was wiped out. It was a mass extinction event. But this disaster didn't just kill people, it killed society. The tight-knit community structures where children played and lived together, where the circle of protection of mild childhood syphilis was maintained, collapsed. Villages were emptied, families were broken. The social networks that had maintained their immunity for millennia were completely destroyed. And here is the dire consequence. With the loss of so many people, they also lost their immunity to syphilis. New generations of Native Americans were born into a broken world. They were no longer exposed to mild childhood illnesses. They had lost the immune shield their ancestors had carried. For the first time in thousands of years, they were completely vulnerable. Now imagine the final blow. Over the decades and centuries next, when European colonists and soldiers flooded in, they brought with them the disease of surname. They carried a mutated version of syphilis, a version will o' the death that European civilization itself has created. They brought this killer to a continent whose population was not only decimated, but now completely bereft of natural defenses. The result was a second disaster. Venereal syphilis, the disease for which they were wrongly blamed, now swept through the remaining indigenous populations with the same devastating force as it had done to Europeans hundreds of years before. This is the ultimate tragedy of syphilis. Native Americans were not the perpetrators. They were the victims, not once, but 3 times. First, they were victims of a lie, blamed by the world for 500 years for a crime they did not commit. Second, they were victims of European plagues, which decimated their populations and destroyed their social structures. And finally, in history's cruelest irony, they fell victim to syphilis itself, not the mild version of their ancestors, but the mutated venereal version of Europe, brought to them after their immune shield had been stripped away by the Europeans themselves. History is rarely tidy, but it is rarely so cruel.